Last night, we reported on allegations that the incoming Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally, currently Bishop of London, failed to act to protect one of her vulnerable priests.
I think that the accusations, the lies that were spread within the church about him would have been devastating to him.
Father Alan Griffin took his own life after a secret Church of England dossier spread false gossip that he abused children and paid for sex. The Bishop of London, Sarah Mullally, claims she never read the report. Written by the former head of operations in the diocese, a man since jailed for a £5.2 million fraud against the church, it contained a toxic mixture of genuine safeguarding concerns and unsubstantiated smears about 42 members of the clergy, including Father Alan. The Reverend Robert Thompson is a London priest and a member of the Church of England ruling body, the General Synod.
I think the entire diocese has blood on its hands. When Sarah presided at the Eucharist, I felt that the blood of Alan Griffin was on her hands. But all of us need to take responsibility for the culture of safeguarding within the diocese.
He says Bishop Sarah's failure to act on the report is so serious she should delay her enthronement as the new Archbishop.
She needs to put a halt on her becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, because it will, I think, destroy the mission of the Church.
After the coroner's damning conclusions about how the church failed Father Alan, a lessons learnt review was commissioned by the diocese. It recommended destroying all but one copy of the secret report, and it urged a complete overhaul of safeguarding.
Michelle Burns joined the London safeguarding team in 2022 and was horrified by what she found. She's never spoken publicly about it before.
We didn't talk to each other, emails were ignored by other colleagues. Management was very domineering and kind of brutish, I would say.
She says the changes promised after Alan Griffin's death weren't being implemented, and she feared other clergy were in danger.
There was one case, actually the victim was a member of clergy who was being stalked and harassed. And I even went to the church to provide some pastoral support for, which is not my role, for this member of clergy because he was distraught. My instruction from the head of safeguarding and line management is that this member of clergy is an adult, has agency and can report crimes himself. I was convinced that with this particular member of clergy that there was going to be another Alan Griffin. And I raised concerns that I was worried about this person's mental health.
And how were those concerns dealt with?
They weren't. I think we put him at risk, and in cases like that, I felt complicit in that abuse because I couldn't do anything. My supervisors told me to just stay away. Don't get emotionally involved, Michelle. Don't get sucked into clergy problems.
When she complained, she says she found herself targeted.
When I raised concerns and raised my voice, I became very quickly isolated from the rest of the team.
The strain took a terrible toll on her own mental health.
Earlier this year, it got quite bad when I was being, ignored and isolated. And it got to the point around Easter time that I was hospitalised.
Can you say any more about that?
I sadly made an attempt on my life.
The Reverend Robert Thompson says he is shocked but sadly unsurprised by Michelle's testimony.
I think those of us who have raised questions about safeguarding are often the ones that are then criticised. I've had particularly low periods and I had to go and see my GP, and I had to go on antidepressants for a particular period of time because of the way that I was treated in relation to a number of issues of abuse that I raised.
After being hospitalised, Michelle says she was eventually forced out of her job. The church then made her sign a confidentiality agreement, which she's breaking to speak to us.
The agreement was not to be disparaging to the Diocese of London or about the Diocese of London, and it was to keep confidentiality about my role within the church.
And what do you think the purpose of all that was?
I think the purpose of it was to save face and to stop the diocese from being embarrassed if I was to go public or to talk about my experiences. In speaking out, I'm taking a risk professionally, and legally. That's a fact. But I think the public and members of the Church of England need to know what's happening on the ground and behind the scenes.
What are the consequences if not?
More people will die, more people will become ill, and they've already got blood on their hands.
The London diocese told us that Michelle Burns left as a result of a mutual agreement that was in a standard form, and that she had not yet made any disclosures to them about her concerns under the diocese whistleblowing policy. They also said, in the instance that she described, the nature of her role meant she would not necessarily have been aware of how the relevant clergyperson was being supported. More than a year since the last Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was forced to quit over safeguarding failings, Bishop Sarah is being urged to consider her position before she's even installed in the job.
Ultimately, the person at the top needs to take the responsibility for failures and safeguarding in the diocese. But the reality is that Sarah's safeguarding failures within the diocese are worse than Justin's. And the reason why they're worse is because Justin's are secondary in relation to disclosures to him that he did nothing about, but which actually he had no direct involvement in. Sarah had direct involvement in the safeguarding culture of the diocese in the time that Father Alan Griffin took his own life, and she is far, far more culpable in relation to that particular death than Justin was in relation to anything that happened with Smythe.
5 years since Father Alan Griffin died, no one has lost their job over the failings identified by the coroner and in the subsequent review commissioned by the Church. Yesterday, Bishop Sarah told us, "Ever since I became Bishop of London in 2018 and before, I have spoken publicly about the clear need for independent scrutiny of safeguarding across the Church of England. That is why I commissioned the Robson report into Father Alan's death, to examine exactly what went wrong in the tragic run-up to November 2020. She went on to say, "I understand why now, as I prepare to become Archbishop of Canterbury, there will be renewed scrutiny of past cases and especially my role, and that we must all be willing to have light shone on our actions regardless of our role in the Church." She says she's determined to improve safeguarding across the Church of England.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Right Reverend Joanne Grenfell, formerly Bishop of Stepney in London and now the Church of England's lead bishop for safeguarding. I asked her if she accepts that something went very wrong in the London diocese in the run-up to Father Alan Griffin's death.
What happened to Father Alan Griffin was an absolute tragedy, and clearly something went terribly wrong. The Diocese of London at the time, with Bishop Sarah at the helm, took full responsibility for that, made a full apology for it, and most importantly, commissioned an independent review, the recommendations for which were then worked through incredibly thoroughly by the diocese. I chaired that work to make sure that we really listened to what we needed to learn and that we therefore changed.
I'll come back to what's changed in a second, but just to draw on something that we reported on last night, which is Bishop Sarah's failure to read this toxic dossier that was a mix of lies and gossip, but also genuine safeguarding concerns about 42 clergy, including Father Alan. And it was lies about him that contributed to his death, the coroner established. Did Bishop Sarah fail in her duty by failing to read that dossier, do you think?
When Bishop Sarah received the dossier around these events, she did absolutely the right thing, which was to make sure that her diocesan safeguarding team, who are skilled professionals, took that piece of work up and went forward with it. It wasn't for her as the bishop to investigate those concerns. It was about handing them over to safeguarding professionals so that they could be looked at properly. That's what she did.
Arguably, by passing it on, she failed to act. And it was a failure to act that led to the unprecedented resignation of her predecessor as Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Now, one of her clergy in London, who's actually also on the General Synod, the Reverend Robert Thompson, says that she's actually more culpable than Welby in terms of her failure to act on this. What do you say to that?
Bishops are acting properly in safeguarding matters when they refer those matters to safeguarding professionals. That's what we all have drilled into us. It's part of our training. Those matters were dealt with. Now, we look at the matters with Father Alan Griffin. We look at the matters with Father Alan Griffin and we know that the Diocese of London should have done things differently, and it has changed as a result of what was learned.
Let me put to you what a safeguarding advisor brought in to help oversee reforms in the wake of Alan Griffin's death has told us tonight. She says that changes recommended by a church review after that suicide were not being implemented. You keep on saying that changes have been made. How many of the Robson Review recommendations have you actually implemented in the diocese?
The largest part of the recommendations, which were around handling allegations, around resourcing of the team, around data sharing, around support for LGBTQI+ clergy, they were absolutely implemented over the year, 18 months after the review was published. And you see that, I used to see that as Bishop of Stepney. My clergy would say to me, when they rang up the diocesan safeguarding team, if they had a concern, if they'd received a disclosure, if they were worried that they might have got something wrong in process terms themselves, they could ring up the diocesan safeguarding team and they got a timely, constructive and consistent response.
It's almost impossible to reconcile what you've just said with what we've been told by the whistleblower, Michelle Burns. She says more priests are at risk of suicide and that when she raised concerns, she was isolated to the point where she actually made a suicide attempt herself. Do you apologise to her on behalf of the Church for how she was treated?
I worked very happily alongside Michelle during her 3 years in the diocese, and I feel very warmly towards her. I think she's someone who cares deeply about safeguarding. As in any team, sometimes there arise situations where there are tensions or there are disagreements about particular bits of decision making. That's not unusual. I'm incredibly sad to hear.
It's pretty unusual for someone
about
to feel so stressed that she tries to take her own life. And she said that was because of the culture within the team. I mean, it sounds like you feel very warm to her. You don't disbelieve what she's saying.
I feel very distressed that Michelle has gone through what she's described. I wasn't aware of that at the time. I have checked and I know that she was offered and indeed given a lot of support. When it became clear that she no longer wanted to work within the team, the Diocese of London invited ACAS to be part of that concluding process. Now, ACAS are really thorough. They leave no stone unturned. And as far as I understand, at the end of that process that enabled her to leave well, there were no unresolved matters. Now, the Diocese of London has a very clear whistleblowing policy and she's very welcome to use it. And if it would help to speak personally, I would be glad to do that.
But she was made to sign a confidentiality agreement. You're in charge of safeguarding. Are you concerned that that has a chilling effect on whistleblowers if they're made to sign those kind of agreements? Is there any place for them in the Church?
When ACAS is involved in a process, there's a very standard confidentiality agreement that is put in place at the end. That's not the same as what you're describing. If Michelle wants to make a whistleblowing complaint, there's a proper process for doing that. She can do that. She can be talked through it and supported to do it. And I would give her every assurance that that will be handled properly and fairly.
Just finally, as we've alluded to, this is not the only controversial scandal presided over by Bishop Sarah. There's also a formal complaint against her over the handling of an abuse allegation by someone known as Survivor N. Isn't it the case that most clergy wouldn't be considered for promotion, particularly not something like the Archbishop of Canterbury, while such a complaint is outstanding?
Bishop Sarah, I think, has demonstrated to me the calibre of her as a person by welcoming the recent steps to look at this, which has, a complaint that has been overlooked should not have been overlooked. And she's been very clear that that needs to be done properly, openly and transparently. I think there are issues. I've said this before, and indeed the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse said it, that disciplinary procedures in the Church of England do need change and reform, and that is currently underway. So I accept that there needs to be change to the system, but Bishop Sarah herself has welcomed that, and I believe will be keen to make sure that that happens swiftly, because that's how victims and survivors are taken seriously, and it's also how clergy know that they're in a proper, fair process.
Bishop Joanne Grenfell, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.